hand over to Rob.
Thank you. Thank you, Lucy. Thank you all of you for inviting me to this seminar. As I got used to saying at these seminars, I'm only sorry that it's remote and I'm not enjoying the fun and pleasure of being in Liverpool, where I understand you're allowed raves these days. So I thought I would talk about technology, and so I've called this signals in stone, and the issue is simply how can we infer something about the cognition of extinct hominids on the basis of their stone tool technology. And I subtitled it, I think, what can we infer, and nothing's happening. What can we infer from stone tools? And I think actually that's a slightly misleading title, because I think I'm going to talk much more about how do we infer cognition from stone tools rather than coming up with particular models. Now, it's been a very long time since I've seen a Gary Larson cartoon in a lecture. There was a time when any lecture on human evolution and the Paleolithic was full of Gary Larsons, but they've been out of fashion for a while. So here's one of my favorite ones, which is, I think sums up pretty much the problem with the Paleolithic. That it's very difficult to know what on earth the stone tools are for, how they're made, as it says, damning stone tools. Well, I'll try and improve on things a little bit. And what I want to do is to start by talking about the challenges that there are in trying to make inferences from stone tools for the first half of the talk, and raise up some of the difficulties, and then go through some of the ways in which I think we can improve the approach we take to build a slightly more sophisticated model. So what are these challenges that there are? So let's start with just what is this is what we're trying to do. We observe a stone tool or an assemblage of stone tools, and we want to end up with some understanding of the mind of the maker. And our big problem is all wrapped up in that arrow and what is going on in that arrow. So this is probably what's going on a lot of the time in the arrow, this cartoon, where I think we should be a little more explicit here in step 2, rather than just assuming it's a miracle. And I think a lot of archaeological and paleontological methodology is largely concerned with trying to understand step 2, the inferences from the observations to the cognition. But part of the problem is that the cognition that we're after at the end, and we might be after other things, but for the sake of this talk, it's cognition that we're focusing on, is not necessarily that directly related to the stone tools. So if we just take that simple model, we can start to think of how there are a whole bunch of other things. So we've got raw material, we have function, manual skill, and cultural norm. So when we observe a particular stone tool or an assemblage of stone tools, it's not always clear that cognition has necessarily very much to do with it. And this is, if you don't know, this is a wonderful paper by David Brown and colleagues looking at older ones, so very crude stone tools, relatively speaking. And what they show is there's a lot of variation across them, and focus in particular on just two parameters, the external platform angle and the platform depth. And one might look at it and say, the thing that is going to determine those two, which will determine the shape of the flake, is what's going on in the mind of the maker. But we know, particularly these stone tools from Gona, which are made on pretty small, horrible raw materials, are constrained by the raw material, nothing to do with cognition. It's the manual skill, which certainly with early hominins is quite a critical issue. How much manual skill is involved? So you might have all sorts of ideas in your head, but transferring this to your hand isn't necessarily a straightforward thing. So we have to be careful not to take an observation and assume it's going to tell us very much about cognition. Either it isn't, or maybe there are too many intermediate steps. So that's the sort of first problem we have to think about. Second is what I now think of as the Boris Bridge problem in paleoanthropology, and that is that we actually have a very long chain of inference between our observations and the cognition. And I don't know how many of you know the work of Berta. He's written a number of papers and indeed a whole book. his challenge, he's a linguist, and he's very interested in the whole issue of how is it that people working particularly at Blombos, for some reason he's picked on Blombos as a type study, people in Blombos can use things like the engravings and the art mobilier or the ochre to infer language, which of course is what happens there. And so he's tried, I can't go into it here, but it's worth reading his attempt to really go step by step through all the data assumptions and the inferences. And he makes the claim that actually these inferential steps are indeed rather wobbly, that they're rather uncertain. So he questions whether, in fact, you have modern language on the basis of that evidence. I think there's plenty of other evidence to suggest that Blombos people 70,000 years ago would have had language. It would be extraordinary if they hadn't by that stage, for all sorts of biological reasons. But it is an important point about how we make the inferences. And so that's why I think we have our inferences, I'm calling them Boris bridges, that they're long, such as his idea across the Irish Sea, wobbly like the one in London, and imaginary in the sense they haven't been built as well. So we have to move on from that. Then the third challenge, which I think permeates an awful lot of archaeology and anthropology, and that is our tendency to use binary models. And the one that we're most familiar with is the idea that there's modern human behavior or modern anatomically modern humans in contrast to archaic. And people have spent a lot of time arguing what is or is not one side of this Rubicon. But the point is that the Rubicon itself is not a helpful way of looking at it. Now, if you come from a philosophical background and you've read your Descartes and have a sort of Cartesian perspective on the world, then this dualistic perspective of mind versus matter, nature, culture, all the rest of it, is one way of analyzing things. But I think from a Darwinian point of view, it's very unlikely, and that the continuity is there. Now, of course, many people have pointed this out, and there's a lot of critique of the idea of modern, and yet we continue to use it. But it is particularly problematic now, I think, because the story is so much more complicated. If I was giving a talk about the evolution of modern humans 15 years or so ago, it would have been relatively straightforward. I have a recent common ancestor in Africa, 200,000 or 300,000 years ago. Modern humans evolve, and they come out of Africa in a kind of mass dispersal 50,000 years ago, and bringing with them modern behavior. But the evidence now for the evolution of modern humans is so much more complex than it was. And I just, in this diagram here,
okay. So we have our Eurasian lineage at the top here and the African lineage leading to modern humans. And what I've just tried to do is show the population patterns there, but each of these little different colors pick up on a different element. So we can talk about evidence for behavioral change in these red bars, and that would be things like the end of the Acheulean, the terminal Acheulean characteristics here. We might pick up on the beginnings of the Middle Stone Age and so on. And other changes such as the anatomical shift to modern humans occurring relatively late here. So I don't want to go into the details of this, but it means that we can't really look at this, a process like this and say, gosh, here is one side that is archaic and the other side that is modern. So the point here is that we have to move to a much more continuous pattern and find a way of measuring almost degrees of modernity, if you want to talk about it like that. I think there's another challenge, and call it a sort of, it's the bling approach to modern human behavioral evolution, and that is so much of what we pick up of as providing evidence about modern human cognition is based on some fairly unusual objects. And so we have again the South African evidence, which is so wonderful. The incisions on the bone from Blombos. We have beads from a large number of sites now. There's things like the engraved ostrich eggshell, water containers, and there's other things like ritual behavior and use of ochre. Now, it's quite clear that many of these now can be found on the Eurasian lineage as well, but that's not the point I want to make. The point is that these things are relatively rare, and so we're picking up little highlights, and so I think of it as rather like it's the tip of the iceberg, and underneath that iceberg is an awful lot of behavior which, for various reasons, we might not observe. And that's really why we have to place more focus on stone tools as a particularly important source of information. The other thing that I worry about is the question of symbolic thought. That is that, you know, I found a quotation from, I shall leave it anonymous, an archaeologist commenting, I think, on the Blombos finds, you know, it's the Blombos, the beads, scream out symbolic behavior. It is the expression of identity, of selfhood, and of aesthetics. And we now have essentially symbolic behavior or symbolic thought as very much a shorthand for modernity, and that this is what's involved. What we don't do very much is think exactly what do we mean by symbolic thought. And so symbols are things that represent the real world, and the emphasis is very much on those external representations, you know, words, images, gestures, pictures, whatever. And that from those come behaviors and actions. But of course, there are internal symbols, and many neuroscientists would probably say that all thought is symbolic in the sense that there is a mental representation going on at whatever level, even if it's a pretty obscure and sort of neuronally coded one, and that underlies things. So that when we think about symbols, they too are much less binary. It's not as if symbolic thought is there or not thought, and it can vary from mediational symbols where there is really just a representation, and I don't see why it can't be a phenotypic representation, is indicating another state. So in the case of the monkey here, indicating reproductive status, and that will go all the way through to highly intentional symbols when we think of perhaps religious symbols, you know, in modern cultures today. So that symbolic thought has, I think, become a bit too much of a bin into which we can put an awful lot of things without necessarily thinking through what it is we're after. And one of the things I want to get at is breaking down some of these ideas about cognition. So those are, as I see, the challenges that we have to overcome. Oversimplistic binary models of modernity, oversimplistic models of cognition, so everything is about symbolic thought. There are many other things going on, or indeed about language. The relatively weak inferential links that lie between objects and the cognition we're inferring, and then the links with other aspects of our behavior, that not everything is necessarily cognitive, and we've got to find ways of overcoming this as a challenge. So how do we progress? So I call this signals in stone, and so the first point I want to make is I think we want to do more work with lithics. And so why lithics? Well, the real reason is there are so many of them. You know, every Paleolithic site churns out, you know, thousands of stone tools, and where, you know, the tip of the iceberg finds such as an ochre crayon are relatively rare. Stone tools provide us with the bulk of our information, and we should be using that, I think, a lot more. Of course, people have for many years, but I think we need to do more work on exactly how we can get that sort of information. As everybody knows, the beauty of stone tools is they bear the marks of their manufacture. The scars of previous flaking tell us about how a process is made. So we don't just have the end product, we have the process of manufacture there as well, in a relatively straightforward way, which has been well studied and reasonably well understood. And they're intentional objects. They're not made by accident, I guess. And so they are, going back to the idea of mental representations, they are the outcomes of that. So what I want to do is to take you through these 5 topics of how we might start to use technology in ways to infer a bit more about cognition. Some of them will take us back in time, and I'm going to talk about some earlier work of myself and of Marta's, and then try and come forward with a few more more current ideas. So the first of these, linking human taxic evolution to technology, and I think one of the great advances, across the last 20 or 30 years has been the recognition that Paleolithic archaeology and technology are much more integrated with the rest of human evolution. If I go back to when I was, a student, and I was taught human evolution in one course, and it was nothing but bones, and I was taught Paleolithic in another course, and it was nothing but stones. And there was virtually no linkage across between the two. And we now recognize, one sees how much these two subjects have come together and converged. But that also means that we can think, how can we use that in order to make rather more of the technology? So the first point is that what is quite clear is that hominin evolution is made up of multiple taxa. And these diagrams are pretty standard stuff, so that we have the range of taxa, time from 8 million years in the x-axis, and just showing the time, the first and last appearance of these multiple taxa. And there are somewhere, let us say, between 20 and 30, depending on how you define those, and they must have a phylogenetic relationship. Well, where that becomes useful is it means that we can no longer really say, well, hominins were making stone tools. Particular hominins were making particular stone tools. And so we can try and get some linkage there between the hominins and what their biological capacities and abilities are, and the technology, and see if we can use that to build some inferences. Well, as they say, here's one I made earlier. This goes all the way back to 1987, a paper I published in Antiquity, which I think was received with not the greatest enthusiasm, I have to say. And it was an attempt to hang the stone tools, the technology, onto hominin phylogeny. Now, I have to remember this is considerably out of date now. The whole phylogeny is as we were thinking about it then, and there's much greater diversity. But the point I was trying to make was that if you looked at it, you could actually see a pattern that was there, which did imply that there was an underlying biological basis for different stone tool technologies and the capacities for them. Now, Marta Mirazon and I developed this idea further with what became known as the mode 3 hypothesis, in which again we took a phylogenetic approach, and using Graham Clark's modes, we pointed out that for quite a lot of our evolutionary history, you can see particular lineages associated with particular modes, so that the Eurasian Homo, the Afro-European and West Asian lineage of Ergaster and Erectus, if you want to call it that, associated with mode 2 technologies. And then we argued in particular mode 3 technologies associated not with either Neanderthals or modern humans, but with both lineages, and suggested that it probably was an ancestral common origin. Now, of course, that introduces then the idea that these technologies have particular histories and relate to particular populations, and they evolve and disperse in relation to those. Now, again, this is a very old, what's this, 1980, sorry, that should be 97, not 87. What the data, again, has moved on very markedly from this. So I don't think I would want to spend a lot of time trying to defend this particular position anymore. But it's the relationship between the two that is critical. Now, with both these papers and the approaches that we and others have developed, there is the kind of view that it's one species, one stone tool. But the point is, and the evidence is quite clear, it's not. There is a relationship between biological lineages and technologies, but they're not simple relationships. So what we did in a later paper here was to plot out the relationship. So if you take the left-hand box there, we can follow the transitions from mode 1 to mode 2. We can look at particular lineages, and so you can say Ergaster looks as if on the current evidence begins making mode 1, and during the course of its evolution mode 2 evolves or develops. So there you've got a change within a lineage. If you take erectus as the Asian group, it starts with mode 1 and it's still making mode 1 many hundreds of thousands of years later. So I'm not going to go through those, the point being that different lineages have different technological histories, and where novelty appears varies. And so if you take the middle box there, one looks at, say, the transitions between different taxa, really only in this model, when we're working then, only really between Heidelbergensis and the later, some people call late Heidelbergensis, what we called Homo helmii, is where there's a technological transition that takes place. And for the rest, it's within the lineages. So there can be a relationship, but it's not a fixed static relationship. You know, a species arises and the technology is associated with it. So we have to work a lot harder, I think, at trying to understand exactly how that works. And I would recommend going into our ideas about how evolutionary change occurs in a slightly broader way. And if we think about when speciation occurs, what is happening, what are elements are going in there, what we know, one of the very big ones is allopatry and genetic isolation. Two populations diverge, and so they end up having separate private trajectories, ultimately resulting in subspecies or species differences. But there are also changes in phenotype that occur. So the basic biology will change in the course of that. And there are changes in behavior. And the little cartoon on the left there is really trying to point out that when we look at those changes, the appearance of new species, the order can vary. So in the top one, the top row there, we might say, well, what changes is that there's some separation and there's drift, genetic drift as they become isolated. That leads to a change in the phenotype, perhaps even in some element of cognition, and a new technology arises. But equally, it could be occur in other ways. And I won't labor the point, so I'll jump down to the bottom row, where one could argue that very often changes in behavior, and technology would be a good example of that, actually lead to the conditions under which isolation could take place, and the genes and the phenotypes follow on from that. So for example, you invent a new behavior, and it could be, say, hand axes, or it could be fire, that creates enormous ecological potential, more dispersals, greater opportunity for isolation, and so you get the separation occurring. And that last one is probably one of the most important phenomena, and biologists have known about it for years. It's often referred to as the Baldwin effect, the role of behavior in starting out other changes. And I put the very interesting paper on evolutionary potential and genetics, but we can rework this to think about it in terms of extended phenotypes and behavior, that across the course of a lineage, from its origin to its extinction, so from the left to the right of this diagram, different things are going on. So in the early stages, genetically, selection is operating on existing standing variation. We could think of that as the existing range of technologies. Perhaps there's a wide range of it. As those changes take place genetically, cryptic variation, so variation that was previously hidden by other genes appears, and selection then operates on those. And again, it could be that those early changes expose new ways of making stone tools or something. And then later on in the system, further mutations going on throughout this, but further mutations occur, creating changes. And that in the technological world might be something like high rates of innovation. So we need to look at the range of taxa and their longevity and what is happening across their whole, from appearance to extinction. The different processes might be going on. So in other words, it's these evolutionary dynamics. And if you think back to the diagram of the more complex evolution of modern humans I was talking about, mosaic evolution of different traits at different times is likely to be the case. So if we move to the second of these, of the things I was going to talk about, so there's that, we've looked at relationship to taxic diversity. And the other thing we can do from a biological point of view is say, what is the relationship between different elements that might reflect cognition in our evolution? And this is a paper I published many, many years ago. So again, it's very out of date, but it could be updated, I think, relatively simply. And what it shows here is that let's think of what are the things that might indicate changes in cognition. And we've got brain size, which can be absolute or relative. It's shown here relative with EQ. We can pick up Robin Dunbar's ideas that it's not brain size overall, it's neocortex ratio that's important. We could take the view developed by many people interested in life history that things like a slowing down of life history tends to reflect brain size, growth, learning potential. So that would be in the mix. And then we can think of the technological components. So we've got here technological complexity, which is taken from a very old paper of Glyn Isaacs, the number of identifiable types, or we can take technological duration, which is how long archaeological taxonomic units last. And you know, in this case, they're all keyed into a modern human standard or current standard. And there's only one point to make here: is they each show a different pattern. And the biological ones tend to show relatively slow, long rate, and the two technological ones, by these two measures, show a much more recent evolutionary change. So if we're inferring cognition from different elements, we would end up with a different understanding of what is happening in hominin evolution. Now, as I said, this is old work and desperately needs updating for a whole series of reasons. But what we could do with is being able to map some measure, could be innovation, it could be rates of change, it could be levels of complexity, and see how these map on and correlate, co-vary with life history and brain size. And that takes us on to brains and modes. So I mean, if we wanted to be really simplistic about this, we could just look at the brain size of different hominins and explore their relationship to particular modes. And we're talking here about Graham Clark's modes of technological modes of production. So mode 1 associated with Australopithecines and early Homo, mode 2 coming in with erectus, that's the hand axis and ashland, and the prepared core technologies. Mode 3, somewhere in the last 500,000 years, 400, 300,000 years ago. And certainly that looks as if you'd have a relatively nice relationship until you got to modes 4 and 5, where there would be none. But as everyone, I think, agrees, well, most people agree, modes are a very crude way, and I don't think I can go through all of these, but Graham Clark's modes have been subject to a whole range of criticisms as to why they're not necessarily going to reflect enough information. A lot of this boils down to the fact that they are too simple. They are based on a European pattern rather than globally ones, and you find different patterns we see in Southeast Asia certainly don't seem to fit that. They're relatively weak in their descriptive devices, and they're not taking into account the whole assemblages. They're just looking at the most derived components of those. And then, of course, Clark himself, I'm sure, probably did think this. They were seen as a progressive and cumulative model. You're building on one technology on the others. And of course, in this case, I think it's a good thing. Modes are based entirely on stone tools and not trying to bring together a kind of overall multi-technological sense of modes. And the modes are so they're seen as a unilineal pattern, and that they don't when you plot them out, modes are chronologically messed up. I think it's fair to say. Now, John Shea, who's done an enormous amount in standardizing a lot of things about the way we study technologies, has suggested an alternative mode system, so his A to I, as a way of capturing much more of the diversity and variation. And I think it certainly does that. But of course, in doing so, it loses the power and simplicity because what it actually captures is not in a sense developmental patterns or evolutionary patterns of change. It captures the diversity within particular assemblages. So things are no longer mode 1 or mode 2. They could be mode A, D, and E, and another one might be D, E, and F, and so on. So one gains things, but one loses them as well. And I think, I think most of the criticisms about modes can be answered, and the one I would really just emphasize here in particular is that the whole point about modes is they are based on the most derived components. If we're talking phylogenetic terms, it's the apomorphids that tell us, that provide the information. And all assemblages will have mode 1 in them, but if they have mode 2, that's telling you something very different. And the other thing is that, of course, the modes are nothing to do with time. Time and classification are different things, and we could have mode 1 existing quite happily today, just as we have coelacanths, which are a very ancient fish lineage, surviving long after it should have gone extinct by the standards of other contemporary fish. So the modes, I think, can be used. And what I would suggest if we're going after cognition is that what we need to do is to refine Graham Clark's modes rather more. And Martha and I have been working on this. It's still to sort of see the light of day. And that we can break down the modes rather more. So if you take mode, forget about mode 0, which is of course not part of Clark's system. If we take mode 1, at its simplest, it is just flaking and fracturing the stone. But we know from sites such as Le Calais, where you have these very, very complex, long sequences of reduction, that the number of sequential flakes varies enormously from what you find in Gona, for example. And and retouch enters in where you retouch the work. So we can then, if you just take the little diagram on the left there, we can think of it as mode 1, but we can then consider whether it has trait 1, trait 2 in order to make it a slightly more refined model. And we can go down through these modes. I have no intention of doing it. We can go down through these modes and use them, and that will give us a much more sensitive, simple measure if we wanted to go back and start thinking the relationship between brain size or particular biological lineages, or indeed ecological and functional reasons. And I think it will also tell us more about the level of cognition involved. And the part of the mode thing is we can also try and think, well, how do the modes map on to cognition? And people have made this, there's quite an extensive history of this, people looking at, and indeed your very own John Gowlitz has probably done more than anybody else in thinking about what do the modes, and basically the Acheulean, for example, what do the hand axes tell us as a category about what is involved in terms of the cognition underlying that. And it's the structure of that. And I've just highlighted here mode 3, which is the prepared core technology. The point about the difference in mode 2 and mode 3 is mode 2 is mode 3 is a very hierarchically nested action. In order to get to the final thing, you have to have done a certain number of events before, none of which necessarily look as if it's leading towards the goal, which is that nice flake in the middle there. And that hierarchical nested action has attracted quite a lot of attention from people thinking that this is not that dissimilar from what you see in language, where you see nested structures in place. And so perhaps the modes can be resurrected a bit in order to make these broader inferences. But I think what I want to do just to finish off is to really introduce very briefly something that we need to do and think a bit more about the cognition itself. So up till now, everything I've said is saying, well, somebody makes a stone tool, and it could be erectus, it could be habilis, it doesn't matter, and there is a kind of cognition involved in that without really thinking about what is involved in that cognition. So just in the same way as we rather lump the outcomes, we also tend to rather lump the cognitive processes. So again, Martha and I, in developing this variable cognition model, have been thinking about how we might quantify this rather more. But it's not I mean, other people have obviously been thinking about this, and I'll just run through a couple of recent papers, or recentish papers, which I think do this a lot, trying to look more carefully. This is the one that I think is focused on the social learning that would be involved. Beautiful experiment carried out by Kevin Leyland and his group, where they took some novices, and they had to make stone tools, and there were 5 conditions. They could reverse engineer. Here's a stone tool, work out for yourself how to make it. They could watch somebody else making it. They could have basic teaching or gestural teaching. I'm not quite sure what the difference is between the two, or they can have verbal teaching. And the interesting thing that comes out of this experiment is that, not surprisingly, the more the more sophisticated it is, the bigger the outcome, the successful outcome. So teaching and gesturing did have an advantage. But one of the most interesting things was they found that the effect of language was much greater in mode 2 than in mode 1. So in other words, language didn't make that much difference. Gesturing was enough to teach you how to make mode 1, but not mode 2. So the processes of social learning can themselves be used as a way of finding out what's going on. Another group working in this direction, which I think has been very, very influential, is Tom Wynne and colleagues. And their emphasis is on the working memory. So, rather like with a computer, you've got your RAM and you've got your hard disk. And the same with your working memory is, when you're trying to remember a telephone number, it's how long you can remember it, 10 seconds or 10 minutes. That's your working memory. And their point is that as behavior gets more complex and as technology gets more complex, that puts more and more demands on working memory. So that what they would argue is that it's working memory that is the driving force. And then if technology drives that working memory, it's then used for lots of other things as well. So you have here a specific cognitive trait, which is important. And I'll come back to that, because working memory is just one of those specific ones that we need to be thinking about. And then there's the work of Heidel. Again, well worth reading. I think is really interesting stuff. And what she and her colleagues have done is to try and work through whole operations from the beginning of an action involving technology through to the final point. So these two diagrams just show you the sort of network of activities on the left for chimpanzees and on the right for sort of simple old Owen carcass processing taking place. And the point about this, and I'm pretty sure, and if John's listening, he can correct me, I'm pretty sure John had a similar thing about hand axes, which he did probably 30 years ago. You can use it then to quantify the number of steps or the number of the complexity of those steps, and get at the level of cognitive complexity in a way that it moves away from what I suggested earlier, the binary problem that we have. And there's just been a paper pursuing a similar approach, Muller et al. And there they create the sort of this planning depth and sequence of activities. But they make a distinction between the breadth of those activities and the depth, so the number of steps versus the diversity of the steps that are involved. And that, again, is a beautiful example where you can extract out differences more clearly. So if you just look at the graph, scale, depth, you can see that different tools, and with long bombs, so simple bipolar or discoidal versus much more complex things with Levallois, that they call on different amounts of depth. So early on, it's the expansion of the breadth that matters. You can see that with the discoid. And later on, it's the depth, so the number of planning steps. So again, we can get a more sophisticated approach to this. Another nice one very recently come out, which I'm running out of time a bit, so I'll keep this very short, is just to think about recursion and chunking. So you're breaking stone tool manufacture down to the same repetitive steps. Everything is essentially the same. Hit a stone, something comes off. And then, so that's their simple scaffold queue algorithm. And then what happens as technology evolves is that these become either multiple or they become extended, and they can put together building blocks of different ones. And it's an interesting approach, which I think is well worth doing, because it's very modular in how you start to put together stone tool technology. So if I just finish off by talking about the one that Martha and I published recently in John Gowlett's Festschrift. And the idea was really to take the point that cognition is not one thing. There are many elements, and we need to disaggregate those elements in order to work out what is it you're exactly inferring. So go beyond what I think was the language and symbolic thought approaches that there have been. So the question then is, can we link particular cognitive processes to their behavioral outputs? And before you get too excited, the answer at the moment is no, but I think we can develop the methods in which we can start to do that. So then we can explore variable rates of cognitive evolution. And so the way we can think about it is to go back to the psychologists, go back to the cognitive science and say, well, what actually is going on? And it's not symbolic thought, it's all these things. It's recursive and combinatorial operations, mental symbols, promiscuous interfaces. I won't go through all of them. You can read as well as I can what they all are. But each one is a different characteristic. So if we jump just to look at a couple of them, recursion, which is what we see in languages, phrases, tunes, where you reorder things, recursion and combination allows new forms to be endlessly produced. And that's something that's right, very much part of modern cognition. Mental symbols, where we convert sensory experiences into external ones, or words and objects coming out. And what Mark Hauser calls promiscuous interfaces, which is combinations of representations across domains. In other words, you take something from technology, your technological, your folk physics in your brain, and you link it up with something to do with social behavior. And that, of course, is where a lot of symbolism comes from, and how you can aggregate technologies. And the point of what we're suggesting is that if we take all these traits, different hominin taxa will have different combinations of them. It's not as if cognition evolves as a single thing. So very simply, contemporary humans, we just assume they're all at 100% for, on the left here, on this sort of idea of a slider switch. And if it was an ape, they're all, depending on what you want to take as your baseline. And the different hominins might show different characteristics. They might have, for example, extreme theory of mind, but virtually no change in let's say, mental symbols. And other hominids might have something rather different. So the point here is to start to build up a much more complex model. And then we want to try and put that into relation with the technology. And what we've done here is just to link it to a particular phase rather than the whole periods. Pre-mode 3, so end of mode 2, early mode 3, and then marine isotope stage 4, when we're moving into the later Stone Age and in Africa or Europe in Upper Paleolithic, if we wanted to go out there. And we can take again our particular cognitive processes and think, how would they score on these slider switches? So that recursive and combinatorial operations, which are evidence for increased number and diversity of the combinations, one might suggest that in early mode 3, there's been a change relative to mode 2, largely because there's so many more combinations involved in doing the preparation in order to get the final product out. Sorry, it's jumping automatically at the moment. Again, I won't go through all these, but the point is then can we plot onto these cognitive processes particular signals from the technology that will indicate things, so levels of combination, amount of fidelity, and so on in the whole process. And as they would presumably move towards the hominin cognition. So in the end, what we're after is to have a kind of a profile of the cognitive states of different hominin taxa in such a way that we can recognize a much more continuous process and a much more mosaic pattern of evolution, and be able to answer questions as to whether early hominin cognition is driven, for example, more by imitation and copying than by innovation or invention. And so we can build this together in a much more sophisticated manner. So that's the idea that we're trying to pursue, is really fragmenting both cognition and fragmenting our approaches to technology. This is we need new methods to do this, and this is just a bit of advertising for a project that we have at the moment in conjunction with the Alan Turing Institute, the Data Science Institute, called Paleoanalytics, and working with two people, Jason Gellis and Camilla Rangel-Smith. We're trying to develop machine learning approaches which can just mop up far more data from stone tools to allow us to do this in a much more quantitative way. This is relatively early work, so I'm not going to say anything more about it, but I think it's enormously promising to allow us to move to a much more subtle approach to inferring cognition from stone tools. So just to finally sum up, everything we do in this business is about long chains of inference, and we need to make sure that they're long. And so I was saying, replacing the Boris bridges that we've had to work with ones that actually work. And a lot of that is improving the quality of the data. And that's the sort of thing that paleoanalytics is trying to do. But in the end, we have to recognize that we will have data and models that will come from lithics, they'll come from from evolution more generally, and they'll come from cognition, the cognitive sciences and cognitive processing. And what we need to do is to work on those three lighter blue boxes, which is looking at the correlations and the covariance. And that, of course, is where machine learning is such a powerful tool to improve the inferences about what it structures the variation in lithics, and then what it does in terms of the links to the cognition. And in the end, say something, which is what I suppose we're all in the business of doing, something about hominin evolution and how and why and where humans evolved in the way they did. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob. That was such a great talk, and I'm sure we're going to have lots of questions. So if you'd like to stop sharing your screen, we'll go into the Q&A. Just a quick reminder before we start doing questions about the poll. I did put a link in the chat, so if everyone could fill that out, that would be great. So Susanna has already submitted a question, so I'll read it out for the sake of the recording. Lithic techno-complexes are a very small component of extant great ape technology and modern non-industrialized societies. That we need to come up with a novel method to assess complexity/variation that includes non-lithic and even look at the presence of behaviours that may not be tool use related, but may leave traces in the landscape that could be detectable in the archaeological record. Also in great apes, brain size does not seem to be an indicator of technological complexity or diversity of tool repertoires, i.e. chimpanzees versus bonobos. I'd love to hear your comments about these points.
Okay, they're all good points and are absolutely right. Some of my responses will be, well, it's a kind of it's a tactical approach. So yes, we should be doing everything, and we want to do more about capturing chimpanzee technology, which is very limited in its use of stone, and so we would have to expand it out more. And of course, I agree entirely that one should be careful about isolating the Stone Age as if what they do technologically is different from what we do with Apple technology. I do recommend, if anyone's interested in kind of getting into the deep theory, a book by a man called Arthur. That's his second name, called What is Technology? And he really does build a theory of it. So, yes, we need to do all those things. But I think tactically we have to do it one by one. Other people can tackle these things. And the point I made is that the nice thing about stone tools is there are so many of them. And I'm a great believer in coming up with robust quantitative ways of doing things. If we tried to include wooden technology, for example, it's almost zero. Bone's a bit better. So I think it's not a theoretical point in response. It's a simple methodological one. As for brain size, yes, brain size is incredibly crude, and of course those brains we might be doing different things. So you know, if most of our brains are really designed to, as Robin Dunbar would say, you know, to deal with social problems, then maybe the social problems of chimps and bonobos are relatively similar, and the technology is a relatively small part. The one thing I would say is that, you know, chimpanzees, yeah, they do some fancy stuff with technology, but nothing on the scale we see even by 2 million years in hominins. And you get, you know, genuine technological dependence. So my guess is that technology has been more of a selective pressure on hominin brains than it has been on ape brains. And exploring that, you know, if one could, in neuroscience, or indeed increasingly in genetics, would be really interesting.
Okay, so I think someone has their hand up. I'll just, Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks for the great talk, really interesting and very wide-ranging. I just have a few remarks, and one of these is going to be the inherent variability that exists within the different regions of Africa. I think Africa has been lumped as one unit. For example, in one of the tables, you mentioned that there is MIS5/4 Africa, and there is great variability within that, even within regions such as Eastern Africa, within sub-regions such as between the Ethiopian main rift and the Afar rift, or the rift and the marginal areas and the highlands. So such variabilities will be sort of blanketed in such an approach. And the other comment I have is, I don't think you have emphasized enough the chronological issues we have in many of the assemblages in hand. Most of the sites have very problematic chronological frameworks, and I think the most important thing, in order for us to understand such variability and technological and behavioral evolution, should be refining and resolving the existing chronological problems in many African sites, and I think that will add a lot more meaning to such a wonderful undertaking that you are embarking on. And the last point I have is about machine learning. Again, I think, if I'm not mistaken, this will be as good as your training data, and as strong as the training data that you will feed it with, and that will also link to the chronological issues and the internal variability. So without such things having been resolved, if we train the machine to give us certain results, well, of course it will give us results, but then how strong will that result be if we do not control for the chronological and other aspects of the data that we feed it in? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. They're all extremely interesting and pertinent comments. I'm going to take them in reverse order. Yeah, I mean, machine learning, you know, it's a terrible catch-all phrase, and it refers to many different things. And I think one should distinguish between, I think, what we're really setting out to do at the moment is to find ways of automating and systematizing data acquisition so that we can do far more. What your concern, which is a correct one, to do with chronology and so on, is something in a sense outside the sort of machine learning algorithms. Those are the external things that you just still would always, you know, require external things. So it's two different things. And as I in a sense, I responded to Susanna, you know, one has to kind of take it baby steps in this whole process, you know, and try and work out our way gradually towards a better approach. But I agree. I mean, machine learning is not the answer to everything. It just happens to be a very powerful tool if we develop things in the right way. Your comment about time, yes, absolutely. I mean, it's rather horrifying how few sites we depend on. If you just take, you know, our understanding of the, you know, so-called evolution of modern human behavior, there are half a dozen key sites in Africa, in South Africa for that matter, which are really telling us a story, and we do need to make that a much better, a much broader approach. And, you know, I very much encourage, we need more fieldwork going on to get more sites that are properly dated to that. But that's again, I mean, that's an enterprise for a whole generation rather than one particular person. And your point about Africa, absolutely. I mean, I've worked in Africa for 40 years or so, and I don't know how many times I have shown Desmond Clark's wonderful map where he squeezes the whole of India, Europe, America, China into the size of Africa, which is 30 million square kilometers. And you're absolutely right, it's highly variable. Had I given a different talk, I could have spent the entire time talking about the diversity within Africa and the significance of that. But I take your point here. I was just making a very simple argument as an example. But if one wanted to do Africa justice, one certainly at every scale. I think one of the interesting questions, prompted by your question, is to think, well, okay, but what is the right scale? I mean, okay, how many? If we chop Africa down to units of 100 square kilometers, that's too fine-grained. Dividing it into sub-Saharan and northern is too coarse. So we'd have to find and think, what is the appropriate regional scale for us to do these sorts of analyses? But anyway, I mean, I take your point. They're absolutely right.
Thank you. So John has put a question in the chat. I don't know if you want to unmute, John.
Yeah, I'll unmute and ask, read it for myself, Rob.
Hi, John.
Hi, Rob. I really enjoyed the way you ranged through all the different approaches, actually, and reached out some of the ones that aren't so well known. That's really good to see, particularly with hierarchical things, the different ways that people are looking at it. But my actual little question that was in there was, do you think that maybe still unconsciously or subconsciously, we're very much tied to the old 19th century progress model?
I don't know. I mean, so yeah. I mean, so just going back to the comment you made. Absolutely right. And I think these, there are so many new things going off. And I will just put in a plug for John, because I think he was right at the beginning, putting together these planning things. You might even publish your first one in a book I edited. I can't remember now. I think we're looking
one of the first.
Yeah. And I think that's the way we have to think about it. Now, personally, I don't think so. I think in terms of progress, I think we've broken away from unilinear models, and certainly the biologists no longer really think everything is diversity, possibly even too much about adaptive radiations and multiple trajectories. So there isn't a sense. I don't think there is that progress as an analytical framework anymore. There still remains the puzzle, because that could. We could, in doing that, we could be fooling ourselves a bit, because I think it is still important to ask the question, at various points in time, new things occur, and presumably those things are better. I mean, one assumes that the Achillea and the hand axe, beloved of you I know, was replaced eventually by Le Valois because it was better at whatever they wanted to do. And so I think we have to recognize that there is an adaptive trend. What we have to avoid is assuming that A, that's inevitable, B, that it's unilinear, C, that it's not reversible, that it is, I'll get my negatives muddled up, that it will be reversible, and we know that those things happen. So we can plot change with progress with a very, very small p without taking on all the baggage that I think you had in mind, saying, are we still thinking of progress in the way? Certainly, I'm sure Graham Clark, when he came up with modes, I am convinced he thought this was an absolutely unilinear progressive thing. As indeed, go back to Mortier, they all saw the whole thing as that as well. Does that answer your question, John?
Yes.
Sort of.
This still leaves us some things to do. Good, thanks.
Okay, so we do have another couple of questions, if you're okay to take them.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Alex asks, What are your thoughts on the effects of demography on cumulative culture and the spread/persistence of novel ideas? It would be interesting to see population densities and estimated interaction rates plotted against technological innovations.
It would indeed. I think, okay, there's a theme coming through all these questions is why aren't we doing more? And the answer is we should be, and we could be. And I come back saying one has to build up from relatively small things. Let's focus on so yes, it'd be wonderful to make that plot. In a sense, my answer to an earlier question implied that we need more data. The chronology and all that's going to make it quite difficult. However, let's take the theoretical proposition, which I think comes very much from the work of people like Steve Shannon and I think Mark Thomas and Powell. I'm sorry, I can't remember his first name. Showing the relationship between population density and cultural complexity, and the idea that culture in small populations, it's the Tasmanian fish paradigm, in small populations, cultural complexity is lost. Yeah, I mean, yes, it has to be true up to a point. My concern is that nearly all those models are based on neutral adaptations. In other words, there are cultural traits that are passed around, but they're not in the models. The traits don't really have any adaptive value. And we did some modeling. I did some modeling with a former PhD student of mine, Carolyn Vagvari, and we decided to try the models, but giving innovations a value. So in other words, if you came up with something really good, it's better. And of course, you get the answer that once you have significant adaptive advantages, in other words, a selective advantage, then demography remains an important part, but it loses its kind of real primary driving force. So yes, the demography is there. Demography is likely to be as much a consequence as technological change or demographic increase as a cause of it in cultural learning. So I would distance myself a bit from what I would call the very strict demographic density models and say, I think it's a parameter we need in there as part of the mix. I don't know where, I can't see Alex, but does that answer your question, Alex?
Well, he's put in the chat, sorry, I didn't mean to criticize.
It wasn't a criticism. No, it's a perfectly good point. I mean, I suppose that let's do it this way. There are three components to all the things that we're trying to do here. One component is just coming up ways of characterizing technology. And that's a data problem. It's a methodological problem, how we measure things. The second problem is the cognitive one. And how do we break down cognition and again, measure that in a useful way? And then the third component, which I didn't really talk about very much at all, is what are the external factors that are going to be in there, which are going to drive the interaction between those two. So in a sense, the environments and demography has got to be one of the most important ones. But demography, of course, will reflect, ecology, resource distribution, climate, the whole catastrophe.
Okay, so the final question is from Anthony. I don't know if you want to ask out loud, Anthony, because I've got a bit of a sore throat today. So.
Can you speak? You're very quiet.
Sorry, Rob, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now, yes,
sorry.
Hi.
Thanks, a really provocative talk. You've partly addressed the first bit, which was work by people like Vygotsky has said that people are capable of doing much more when they are surrounded by others that are slightly better than they are. And so part of what we're looking at in terms of that variability is a product of not just the individual, but it's about their social group around them. And I suppose there's a question of how we begin to factor that in. And it may be in terms of demography or not, but I was wondering how you might think about that. And I suppose the second thing, which goes back to that very beginning, the problem we've always had is that when we want to go from cognitive stuff or from the material record to the cognitive, it's about the quality of our warranting arguments in terms of making those steps, something that I think Bota was emphasizing. And I wondered how positive, enthusiastic you felt about that.
I think I'm enthusiastic for somebody else to do the work. because it's absolutely essential work, but it's extraordinarily difficult to try and tease out. Bota's reading, reading Bota is a bit depressing in a way, because of course he points out, just how many black boxes there are in so many of the things that we do, and we do need to open them up. I suppose my worry is that, we could spend our entire lives, fiddling around with these methodological niceties, where actually what we really need to do is to get some more data, and as Jonathan said, more dates and so on might be a more profitable way of doing things. I mean, the first point you make is a really interesting one. It's one that I think I'm kind of probably a bit out of date on the whole thing, and that is that the notion of distribute. I mean, what you're drawing attention to is the idea of distributed intelligence. That when we certainly look at our own behaviors, and you get into modern technologies, we have Google. Let's put it as simply as that, and everybody will know exactly what I mean. We have Google, and if that, that is distributed intelligence, I don't need to do these things. And presumably part of the demographic argument, although it's not the one I think Powell had originally, is that, the more people there are, the more you can share the knowledge, so that not everybody has to, in effect, it's like having a slightly larger computer or larger memory at any rate. So I think that is critical. I have to confess, I've done very little kind of serious thinking about how we would put that in. I mean, trying to think, how would we operationalize that in relation to technology? And I suppose one would have to start looking at, more closely at real levels of variance in assemblies. But that's a good question, which I don't, sorry, I'm rather disappointing. I don't think I can give you a very sensible answer to, because I think I simply don't know how to deal with it operationally.
Okay, thank you for that question, Anthony. So I guess we'll call it a day there. So thank you very much, Rob, for such a great talk and Q&A. And thank you, everybody, for coming along today. And we'll see you all next week.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me and listening. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.